I hear no objections, so I'll start. Let me first start by welcome everyone to the technical meeting on innovative approaches to improve sampling efficiency and coverage. So the meeting will be spent for 2 days, 3 hours per day, 3 hours today and tomorrow. This is a meeting co-organized by the Intersecretary Working Group on Household Surveys and the ECLAC Statistics Division. So for everyone who are here today, I would not really need to emphasize how important and fundamental sampling is for household surveys. And improving sampling efficiency and coverage is one of the 8 technical priorities of the paper prepared by the Intersecretary Working Group on Household Surveys. The name of the paper is Positioning Household Survey for the Next Decade. I'll put a link in the chat after. So this paper was prepared by the group and endorsed strongly by the UN Statistical Commission to use as a guide to support the work of national statistical offices. So sampling is one of the 8 technical priorities. Continuously to make improvement to sample frames and also adopting innovative sampling techniques are really important to improve sampling efficiency and coverage in household surveys. Unfortunately, there have been a lot of challenges. I've seen them in the registration form, and then we've received a lot of questions from countries and from many of you on how to improve sampling efficiencies and how to improve the frame, how to update the frame. And there has been a lot of challenges with our traditional frames, like censuses has issues with coverage, and they're outdated very soon, and there's so much more other information available. Can we really use other information to improve sample frames? And of course, there are also challenges when during COVID, we see that lots of countries would like to do CADI, phone survey and web survey, but there are no such information on the existing frame. So how do we contact our respondents? So these are really the practical questions from many of you we've gathered. So in these 2 days, we'll really here to foster knowledge exchange and asking questions, and see whether we can find some practical solutions or maybe work together moving forward. I hope really this will become an opportunity for informal exchange, very informal, and foster further discussions and collaboration in this area. I would like to hear more from the speakers and the audience about your challenges and your practical solutions and how do we move forward together. Now, just a sneak peek of what's going to happen from the UN Statistics Division. So we will be starting the revision of the UN Handbook on Household Surveys very soon. The set of handbooks were produced between 1980s and 1990s, so they're very old, but very helpful at the time. So discussions in this meeting will very much inform the revision process. Before I announce a few housekeeping rules, I would like to really thank our advisory group members, Sharon Law from Arizona State University, Dylan Boulette from Statistics Canada, JP from Uruguay National Institute of Statistics, and James from Uganda Bureau of Statistics. And lastly, to our long-term partner, Andres Gutierrez. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here with us today from the ECLAC Statistics Division. Any questions? Well, you can't ask me questions because I muted all of you. So housekeeping rules, your mic and cameras have been disabled. They will be reactivated at the end of the presentations for comments and questions or at Q&A sessions. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, please post your questions in the chat. With that, let's start. Raise your hand if you have objections. Oh, shall we start? Sharon, I will be moderating the first session. We're ahead of our time. I'm so good. I only took 5 minutes. Okay, calling to my speakers, and the first one. So in this session, the session is the overview of challenges of innovations in sampling frames and sampling. And I'll be moderating the session, and we'll have 3 distinguished speakers. And the first one, I'll start with Sharon Lord, who is currently a professor emerita at Arizona State University. And anybody who doesn't have a book on their bookshelves from Sharon, and then I think you need to buy one right now. So she has published widely about survey sampling, design experiments, and statistical methods for education, public policy, and law and crime. She is a member of the Committee on National Statistics of the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Today, Sharon will present a recent publication she led in developing. Very recently published. I'll put a link in the chat as well. So her title, the title of her presentation is Towards a 21st Century National Data Infrastructure, Enhancing Survey Programs by Using Multiple Data Sources. Sharon, the floor is yours. I'm going to, run the slide from my side, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Just a sec. Second. Do you see the PowerPoint mode?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Sharon, go ahead. First.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be able to speak with you today about a recent report from the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine on enhancing survey programs by using multiple data sources. Next slide, please. So it was my honor to chair the panel of experts that worked on this report. And in this talk, I'm not going to go through the case studies in detail, but I want to give you an overview of the report, summarize some of its key conclusions, and I hope whet your appetite for downloading and reading the full report. Next slide, please. So this project started in 2021 with funding from the National Science Foundation for the National Academies to convene 3 studies on a vision for a new data infrastructure. Probability surveys have been the foundation of many U.S. statistical indicators since the 1940s. But surveys face increasing challenges from non-response, burden on respondents, and cost. At the time that many of these probability surveys were initiated, they were the only data available. That's no longer the case. Administrative data, data from satellites and sensors, and other data sources now abound. And the focus of this series of reports is on envisioning a federal data infrastructure that takes advantage of these new data sources in conjunction with surveys. The first report in this series focused on desirable attributes of a new data infrastructure. The third report will focus on privacy and confidentiality protections that are needed when combining data. And our report, the middle child in the series, focuses on how using administrative records and other data sources might enhance information that is currently produced by surveys. Next slide, please. Our specific statement of task directed us to look at 3 implications in particular. Issues of measurement when new data sources are used, assessing and enhancing representativeness of data sources, and implications of using new data sources for coverage of population subgroups, as well as for creating longitudinal data resources. Next slide, please. To make the report concrete, the panel decided to focus on 4 use cases that illustrate different paths for combining data. The U.S. Census Bureau and the U.S. National Center for Health Statistics both have well-developed data linkage programs, and we looked at the use of data linkage in those areas to improve measurement, add variables not found in the survey data, and to build longitudinal data resources. The area of crime statistics presents different opportunities and challenges. One of the main sources of data is a federal-state cooperation where states supply information about crimes that are known to law enforcement agencies to the federal government. Finally, we chose to focus on agriculture as an illustration of combining data in an establishment survey setting, where information from administrative records and satellites is used to produce crop estimates for counties in the United States and for provinces in Canada. We decided to adopt a data equity framework to address issues of representativeness and population subgroup coverage. And I'll talk about this framework a little bit later. And to avoid repetition with the other reports, we focus on the information and equity gains that can be attained from different methods of combining data. And we refer readers to reports 1 and 3 for issues of data sharing, data access, and confidentiality. All of our conclusions are supported with examples of state-of-the-art practice from our 4 use cases. Plus, we make suggestions where further work on integrating data might benefit those areas. Next slide, please. We structured the virtual public workshop around these themes. Our first session had overview presentations about the use of multiple data sources at the Census Bureau, Statistics Canada, and ISWGHS. This was followed by 3 sessions focusing on our use cases and a final session on issues of data equity. And the video for the workshop is available online at this link. Next slide, please. The report follows a similar structure. After a couple of introductory chapters on why we need to look at combined data and on what types of data are available, we introduce the key concept of data equity in Chapter 3. This is followed by 5 chapters related to the overview session and the use cases, and a final chapter summarizing common themes and some steps for moving forward. I would like to encourage you to download the report. It's free, and the report gives the details of the examples I'm presenting in this talk. Next slide, please. So this report focuses on using information from alternative data sources to enhance information that is coming from probability surveys at the present time. We do not conclude that surveys should be replaced by administrative data. Alternative data sources can provide information that can be used to evaluate and improve quality of individual data sources, provide additional information about survey respondents, and produce statistics for small populations. In some cases, it may be possible to create data products directly from administrative data or other data sources, provided it can be shown that the administrative data will produce high quality information and have continuing availability. Next slide, please. Using multiple data sources to improve data quality is one of the major themes of the report. The report discusses how the quality components delineated by the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology are affected by data combination methods. Administrative and private sector data, for example, are often highly granular and provide options for producing detailed information for small population subgroups, but they may be missing parts of the population. Combining them with surveys or other data resources can improve the coverage while retaining the advantage of the increased granularity. Next slide, please. Combining data sets can also enhance data equity, enabling the production of accurate statistics for subpopulations of interest, with emphasis on subpopulations that may have been historically underrepresented or misrepresented in the data record. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit more about data equity. And we used the framework of 4 aspects that was delineated by Jagadish and colleagues. Our report focuses on the top 2 aspects. Representation equity is achieved if populations are accurately represented in the data and if there is an adequate sample size to produce reliable statistics for these populations. I'd like to note here that the report emphasizes that probability samples have a continuing and crucial role for representation equity. Feature equity refers to what is measured in the data. For example, tax records include all taxpayers, but because U.S. tax forms do not measure race, they cannot be used to produce statistics that are disaggregated by race or ethnicity without additional information. Feature equity also encompasses measurement accuracy in that survey instruments and administrative records may have less accurate information for some subpopulations than others. Our report touches on issues of equitable access to the data products and aspects of outcome equity. For example, we mention issues of privacy and confidentiality and the possibility that some subpopulations could be harmed by publishing highly disaggregated statistics. But in general, we leave these issues for other reports and focus on representation and feature equity. Next slide, please. Chapter 3 gives some examples of how using multiple data sources can enhance data equity. We discuss examples where alternative data sources are used to investigate coverage of sampling frames, enable finer levels of data disaggregation, publish statistics for small subpopulations, and assess and reduce error in measuring race, ethnicity, and income. Next slide. Multiple data sources can also add features to survey and administrative data through data linkage and imputation. But we also caution about possible unintended consequences of combining data sets. There is a substantial amount of research indicating that linkage quality varies across population subgroups. For example, linkage systems that match records by name are often designed around Western European name patterns and don't account for cultural differences. For example, for communities where people have 2 surnames or where names are in a different order. There are also equity implications when using small area or imputation models, where predictions may be less accurate for populations that are less well represented in the data used to fit the model. And as will be discussed in Report 3, there are implications for confidentiality because the linked data contain more information about individuals. Next slide, please. The report has 3 conclusions about how multiple data sources might improve data equity. The first draws on the examples I just mentioned to say how multiple data sources can be used to investigate coverage and produce disaggregated statistics. We also stress the importance of assessing data equity aspects of linkage procedures and of documenting equity aspects of data products. Next slide, please. Chapters 4 through 8 of the report then go through how these principles of data quality and data equity apply to specific use areas. When administrative data are collected regularly and have information that can be used to link records, they can be used to construct longitudinal data sets. And we give 4 examples of projects where longitudinal data sets have been constructed from administrative records. The Census Bureau's Frames project, currently underway, is linking information from the Bureau's geospatial, demographic, job, and business frames to make individual frames more accurate and up to date, and to create a resource for research that can draw on all of these arenas. The National Statistics System illustrates different challenges for combining administrative data, where it is important to make sure all states contribute data and to ensure the quality of those data. We also discuss several innovative state level and regional initiatives that use ideas that might scale up to the national level. Next slide, please. Chapter 5 then focuses on the use of linkage to better understand and improve measurement of income. We review a number of studies that have linked survey data to administrative data in order to investigate characteristics of non-respondents or to study how well amounts and types of income reported in surveys agree with those in tax and earnings records. We then describe two Census Bureau projects in which survey data are linked with administrative data with the goal of getting the quote best possible unquote estimates of income and poverty from the merged data sources. Next slide. Data linkage has also been used to study measurement properties of health survey data. But in Chapter 6, we focus on the ability of linkage to add variables to survey data. This is especially important for relating survey items to later outcomes that are not measured in surveys, outcomes such as mortality. We discuss some of the data equity impacts of linkage. For example, deceased persons with low quality information in the linkage variables are less likely to be matched with records in the National Death Index, and that has implications for accuracy of mortality analysis for different subpopulations. And we also document best practices for investigating and documenting the quality of linked data. Next slide, please. Our last two use cases, crime and agriculture, focus on data combination methods other than linkage. There are two major U.S. data sources for measuring crime. The National Crime Victimization is a household survey. The other major source, the Uniform Crime Reporting Program, is a state-federal cooperation that collects data from law enforcement agencies. The challenge is that this program has just made a transition to a new data system that captures more details of individual crime incidents, but is missing data from a lot of law enforcement agencies that had previously participated in the earlier program. There is thus a lot of scope for using other data sources to improve crime statistics. Expanding the use of alternative data sources and developing new sources could enhance data equity by providing improved statistics on crimes such as fraud and corporate crime that are not well measured in the current systems. Better coordination of crime statistics and developing new data sources has great potential to improve the accuracy, granularity, and coverage for crime statistics. Next slide, please. For agricultural statistics, we look at yet another method of combining data. A previous National Academies panel recommended using statistical models to estimate crop yields for small areas. And since then, the U.S. National Agricultural Statistics Service has developed and implemented such models. So we described these models in detail, and we also described some related work by Statistics Canada, where Statistics Canada was taking 6 field surveys each year, and they've been able to replace 2 of those surveys with model-based estimates. For agriculture, the panel sees great potential for increased use of remote sensing data and for use of data collected by some farm operations through precision agriculture programs. There are equity considerations here, though, in that small farm operations are less likely to have the resources to have detailed data collection from drone imagery, soil sensors, and sensors on tractors. There's also the issue that remotely sensed data can tell you a lot about crop cover, but not about the characteristics of the people who grow those crops. And we suggest that data linkage could potentially be used to obtain such information. Next slide, please. The last chapter of the report draws together some of the common themes from the use cases and emphasizes the importance of having quality standards that are tailored for integrated data systems, of making sure that procedures used to combine data are transparent and well documented, and of having the people and the resources needed to realize the potential gains from integrated data. A major message of our report is that taking advantage of multiple data sources is not simply a matter of grabbing a convenience data set off of the shelf and running it through statistical software. but it requires a lot of research and careful attention to data quality, population coverage, and measurement properties. And I'd like to conclude by again encouraging you to download the report to read the details of the case studies and the full set of conclusions. And here again is the web address for doing that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for sharing the report. Let me stop here and a summary of the report. It's an excellent book and it has so much information with the recommendations and also example and case studies from the US and Canada. So please check it out. And now I would like to go for the second speaker. We have Bertrand Berfia. Did I pronounce your name right?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes. So
Okay.
thank you. So you will be giving us a glance of the challenges you face for the Pacific Island countries, right? So Bertrand is a household survey advisor for the Pacific Community Statistics Division. The floor is yours, and now my colleague Zichi is going to share the PowerPoint per side.
Thank you. Just like I cannot see the PowerPoint on my screen, so but doesn't matter. I can just talk and just I can use my PowerPoint. That's fine.
I
Because
think it's coming
Sorry.
up soon.
It's still
the slides
loading.
are not showing on my screen.
Give it 1 second.
It's loading.
Okay. But even the slide from Sharon were not showing on my screen. That's fine.
Do you see anything?
No.
Would you like to share from your side?
No, but that's okay. I mean, just I can follow on my screen and just like comment on the slides. That's fine. So yeah, I'm not a sampler. I'm not a sampling expert. My role is to provide technical assistance to Pacific Island countries or member countries. So I'm going to take you through some of a bit of a context of the region where I'm working, which is the Pacific, and the context of what the statistics division is doing in terms of technical assistance, a little bit of background on survey program in the region, and some sampling challenges we are facing in the implementation of household surveys. And so next slide, please. On the Pacific community, so 27 member countries. Some are countries, some are territories, but we are dealing with both. They're all members. We go from big countries. The bigger is PNG, Papua New Guinea, with more than 12 million people. And then we have Fiji, 1 million people, and Solomon Island. And we have very small island countries such as Tokelau, Niue, less than 2,000 people population. So we are dealing with in the context of the Pacific Island countries, we are dealing with really different size. And in terms of sample and computation of sample size and sample design, it could be very different, of course. All the countries have a statistics office, so we are dealing with them directly. They are our main counterpart for technical assistance. Here is an example of Kiribati. Kiribati is one of the member country we are working with, 120,000 people spread across 32 atolls, so flat islands. And you can see on the map that the size of the country is very big in terms of Pacific Ocean, and the highlands are very spread across 4,000 kilometers, which make
Bertrand,
the
excuse
yes.
me. Just hold on a second. I want to make sure that everyone's seeing the slide. Can you see the presentation?
On
I can
my
see
screen.
the presentation.
Okay,
you
on
can
my
see
screen.
it.
On my screen, it's not showing.
So it is.
I don't know why, but that's fine.
Colleagues, I see a few messages. If you do not see it, one suggestion is to log out and log in again. I think that could fix the problem. Okay, now I think many people can see. All right, go ahead, please.
Okay.
Sorry, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the Kiribati is one of the typical country we are dealing with. Made of like several islands. Most of them are far remote, and logistics is one of the main challenge when it comes to collection, census and surveys, because transport is very expensive. There are very few infrastructure for flights or boats. So moving from one island to another one, it's a kind of a challenge. So the case of Kiribati is typical case in the region. Like if you go to Solomon Islands or Vanuatu, you will face the same issues. So Kiribati, just to keep going on Kiribati, we are currently working on Kiribati with the household income expenditure survey. Most of the population live in urban atoll, which are like high density population, but the rest is spread across more than 30 atolls on outer island, rural. National surveys are expected to be disaggregated at the island level. So in Kiribati, we have 5 island groups. One of the island groups is very small, which is another challenge in terms of sampling. So as I said, transport and logistics is a problem. And just to refer back to the previous presentation, in most of the Pacific Island country, the administrative data source is very low and very poor. That's why household surveys are very important. So we collect most of the information through household surveys. Household surveys are main source for SDG computation and national priority, national indicators. Most of them come from household surveys. When it comes to poverty, living standard measurement, food security, even education, health, we are sourcing that from household surveys. The statistics division, so we are based in New Caledonia, so we provide technical assistance to those Pacific Island countries. In terms of sampling, in terms of household survey, we are providing technical assistance to National Statistics Office in the implementation of their national surveys, from the sampling, the design stage, questionnaire design, fieldwork plan, training of field staff, fieldwork monitoring, and then data processing, data editing, processing, cleaning, and analysis and reports through, and then archiving and documentation. We are now supporting survey on CAPI using Survey Solution Platform. So we had some great collaboration with World Bank on this, which is very helpful. So the main survey the country are conducting is the HICE. So the HICE, Household Income Expenditure Survey, is for most of the Pacific Island countries the main source for CPI, GDP updates, and as well as poverty assessment, food security, and a long list of other SDGs that's coming from the HICE. And then the HICE program is highly supported by the World Bank in collaboration with us. And then we have the mix, so the mix supported by UNICEF. So we provide technical assistance to mix as well, mainly in terms of sampling. And for the labor force survey, we have a partnership with ILO at some stage of the different stage of the implementation and of the survey, the labor force survey, from sampling to fieldwork monitoring, editing, and a bit of reporting. So we're trying to get some partnership with international organization to get technical advice and technical support from them. So World Bank, UNICEF, and ILO are the main one we are dealing with, and FAO as well. So there is big demand in survey data. So we can see that in the last 20 years, the demand in survey data has increased drastically, especially since 2015. We are more and more surveys. The countries are conducting more and more surveys. So in addition to high, mixed, and ILO that I was mentioning before, we have new topics. And country wants to run survey on gender, on disability, on climate change. So new topics, a big demand on those survey data. So each time we need to assist them with sampling, with questionnaire. So now we are very a bit stretched. The team is a bit stretched because the survey demand is getting very big now. So sampling challenges. So yeah, it's quite of a big issue. Sampling. The first challenge for us in the region is we have no sampling expertise in the region. So we are a bit far and remote from all the main sampling expertise. So we try to connect with international agency to get sampling expertise, but it's a bit difficult. There is no expertise in-house. In terms of sampling frame, we usually use census. Some countries conduct household listing when the census is like more than 2 years old. Additional cost, of course, more time, more resource on that. But we try to encourage them to update household listing. In some cases, when we do two-stage sampling design, we just update the household listing in the selected EAs only, which makes things a bit cheaper and faster. On the sampling frame, we don't have any address, so there is no address. We just use the GPS location and the name of the household head, which can be as well as a problem sometimes. And some country wants to use some replacement list in case of refusal or non-response. That can be high in some cases, especially because people are moving a lot from one island to another one at some season of the year. So we may end up going in an island to do survey, and like most of the population moved. So it's difficult to find the households sometimes. The most common design is a two-stage design. But if you look at Kiribati, when you conduct a survey on a two-stage design, so you select some EA, some primary sampling unit first, the EAs, the enumeration area, and you end up with EAs all over the place, all around the country, which make the survey very expensive in terms of transport and logistics. And we are like sometimes tended to use the three-stage design. So we select island and EA and households, which makes things a bit like in terms of data quality, a bit of a problem, but in terms of cost. So we have sometimes to make some compromise between data quality and costs. Another challenge is the exclusion of some island, or exclusion of some population that are very difficult to reach because of like remoteness, or it could be like because some people live far from the coast and it's a long way to reach in some countries as well. So we sometimes exclude more than 10% of the population from the selection, which I feel like it's another problem. We try to encourage to give a chance to everyone to get selected, but sometimes the country, they just stop us on doing that, and they want just to exclude some part of the country from the selection. Another challenge is the choice of the variable of interest for the sample size computation. In the case of the height, we use the per capita expenditure. In the case of the mix, we're using I don't remember which one is the UNICEF recommended, but there is one. And in the case of ILO, LFS, maybe labor force participation rates. But when we conduct other survey on different topics, sometimes we don't have any data to use because that's the first time they conduct this survey. So it's a bit difficult to compute sample size and to have like a clear idea of what could be the expectation in terms of accuracy for this specific survey. A big issue is the size of the questionnaire because surveys are quite expensive and long to come from a long process. So they tend to add a lot of new section, new question in the survey, and we end up with interview that lasts more than 4 or 5 hours sometimes, especially if the household size is big, like household with more than 10 people. You can spend one day for interview to interview the whole household member. So it's a big issue for us. So we're exploring some idea of why don't we select only one person or two person in the households, or why don't we randomly select some section just to make it shorter. The geographical stratification. So usually we stratify by province or island group, by geographical division. this is something we always do, and I'm not sure that's something we should do in every survey, but that's something the country are pushing for because they want to compare this region with this region. And so that's the way we do stratification. It not be an issue, but I'm wondering if there are more efficient way to do stratification in this context. And then another issue, like when we conduct survey in small island countries, when you have less than 1,000 households, it's very difficult to conduct a mix and then a HICE. And sometimes when you do that, the statistics office, they want us to remove the selected households that were interviewed for mix in the HICE. So we end up with very few households available for the next survey. The survey program, as I said, is a bit like tough and intense, and they conduct sometimes 2 or 3 surveys in 1 year. So we keep on interviewing the same households. So there is a type of household fatigue from the respondents, which makes things a bit difficult and affect data quality. But in addition to sampling error, I feel like more we have to deal with non-sampling error, like data issues, questionnaire not properly tested, the supervision in the team, in the field supervision is sometimes very poor or too expensive to implement. And of course, the length of the questionnaire, the size of the questionnaire, which makes the interview far too long in some surveys, like the HICE, for example, that affect data quality. So these are some challenges that we have to face. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bertrand. Thank you for highlighting all the challenges in the Pacific. Let me see whether I have the... Yes, I saw the presentation. Now I would like to move to our third speaker, Silan Boulet, who is Section Chief in the Social Statistical Methods Division at Statistics Canada. She'll be presenting an overview of the sampling frames and recent experimentations in sampling at Stats Canada. Let me go to your share your presentation there. Let me know when you see your slides running.
I can see it. Can other people see the slides?
If you cannot see them, post a message in the chat because I muted everyone. So they wouldn't be able to speak up.
All right.
Hand up. Someone's hand is up. Who is this? Oh, it's okay. Okay.
All right. Well, perfect. Well, thank you very much. It is really my pleasure to be able to come here and then to share some of our experiences at Statistics Canada. Just following up on the last talk that Bertrand was mentioning, the challenges that we face, even though we're not at all in the same context, have quite a few similarities. And so I think it's interesting to be able to have these exchanges where we can really see what's in common and hopefully establish contacts in order to at the very least commiserate, but also find solutions to the challenges that we're facing. So as Hao Yi was saying, I am chief of the section at Statistics Canada. Oh, next slide, please. So I'm responsible for the section at Statistics Canada that deals with the methods for new social data collection initiatives. So we're looking to continuously transform our social statistics programs. And part of that is investigating new tools, investigating new approaches to things. And so my team and I are responsible for that. So the plan for today is to give an overview of ongoing development that's going on. Now, I could have picked one example and gone into into detail, but I wanted to give you an overview of what's going on. And just one bit of warning, what I'll be presenting is far from exhaustive. Statistics Canada is a rather large agency. We've got well over 100 people working on social statistics on the methodologist side. And so there's no way that I can cover everything that is going on. So next slide, please. So there'll be two main themes. So as I was thinking about how we're innovating, our designs on social surveys have been evolving, and a central theme is that it is the evolving of our frames that allows us to actually improve on our methods. The frames are absolutely central to what we're able to do in terms of sampling. And so I wanted to go through those, the connection between the frames that we use, the current directions that we're working on, and the lessons that we're learning. So some of the challenges at the same time. And then a second theme to be looked at is the experimentation that we're doing with non-traditional methods. There's more than just the two examples that I'm going to mention, but I'm going to talk about experiments we've been doing with web panels and with crowdsourcing. Next slide, please. Okay, so first theme, our social survey frames. So we don't just use one frame. In fact, depending on the social survey, we have a wide variety of frames that we actually use. So we've got area frames, list frames of dwellings that we use, and also list frames of persons. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of area frames, this is maybe the most traditional of the frames that we currently use quite a bit. It's used for our labor force survey. It's used for a good number of other surveys as well, and their sampling is coordinated between all of the surveys using this frame. It is especially useful these days in order to be able to do clustered samples when we have in-person collection. Next on the list, we've got list frames of dwellings. Now, this is maybe the most popular of our frames these days. It's used for, let's say, most of our social surveys. And it's used whether we target a household or whether we target it individually by first selecting a household and then selecting a person within that dwelling. We also use list frames of persons. So in this case, we use them if we want to target special populations or get to a domain of interest that we can't get to otherwise. And here we don't just have one frame, but we actually have a number of files that we can use. So the census is, of course, a very common one, a very useful one. But we also have administrative data that we can use as frames. So tax data, for instance, giving us, if we look at child tax benefits, lists of parents and child, and being able to target those populations, immigration data in order to cover that domain as well. And there's really an increased use of the person frames these days. So if we look at these, they're really listed in order. So we're moving slowly a little bit away from area frames, though they still remain quite useful, moving into dwelling frames and lately moving more into persons. Next slide, please. So what makes our frames so useful and what really allows us to build upon and really improve our sampling is really the connection between these frames. That's one of the big strengths of the system that we're working with. So for instance, our dwelling frame and our area frame are linked so that we're able to establish dwelling lists within most of the clusters on our area frame. And this means that we can really be more efficient in our collection. Even if we use our area frame, we can still get quite a bit of contact information through linking to the dwelling frame to get that information. So addresses, telephone numbers, email even. It also allows us to move from a clustered sample to a one-stage design, but not in an all or nothing kind of way. We can keep part of the country using a clustered sample and use a single stage design for other parts of the country. Now, in Canada, that's actually something that's fairly important. We have most of the population that live in our cities, around the southern border of the country, not terribly quite densely populated areas. And then we have a very, very large portion of the country that is much less densely populated and much more difficult to get to, in which case clustered samples can be quite useful. So the ability of being able to do a partial move towards a single stage design is one that can be interesting from the point of view of efficiency. Next slide, please. Another way in which the link between these files is useful is that we can use the person files to add socioeconomic information to our dwelling frame. So this information can come from census, can come from administrative sources. It can give us information such as the expected household characteristics. So what is the household composition, size and age of individuals living there? What is the expected income of a household? Now, these are expected characteristics because when people have moved, we may not be able to follow exactly what the characteristics of the new occupants of a dwelling are. But even having that expected information can be quite useful. For instance, stratifying by age can be useful for a health survey or a substance use survey. Stratifying by expected net worth is quite useful on our survey on financial assets and debts. And it can also simply be used to improve the efficiency of the design in the case where we first select a household and then select a person within that household. So if we know how large the household is going to be, the number of eligible people, then we can be more efficient in terms of how we sample. Next slide, please. Another useful bit in terms of links between our frames is the contact information that we can get. So by linking our dwelling frame with person file, we get extra contact information that goes in both ways, regardless of which of these we're using as a frame. You'll note next to it on the slide, there's sort of 3 gold stars next to the email address. One thing that we've done now a few censuses is to ask for contact information on the census. There's good parts of the country in which mailing addresses and physical addresses are not the same in Canada. So you might have the physical place where a house is located, but the postal address is different. So we ask for that, and we also ask for email addresses on census, giving us another way of contacting households when they've been selected to remind them to answer our surveys. Getting those email addresses in the context of Canada has probably been one of the biggest things that we've done to counter decreasing response rates. It's a very efficient way of getting to people, and also very cheap, not to be neglected. And it's been absolutely critical to being able to join people as communication modes are changing. Next slide, please. So in terms of current development, on the dwelling frame slide, at the moment, we're moving towards our next generation of dwelling frame. So we've had a dwelling frame, the address register, for a while, and now we're moving towards a version that we're calling the statistical building register. They're somewhat similar products, but they're based on a slightly different approach. The new generation is based on administrative data files first, subsequently combined with census in terms of forming the list. And so it makes us less dependent on census overall, and it gives more options for what the census can do in terms of integrating administrative data. We're going through that transition at the moment, and I have to highlight that it's not particularly simple to do. Time is required to refine the use of the new frame, learn how to use it, adapt our approaches to it. And transition planning, as much as it was identified for a long time, is something to actually take seriously as you're moving from one to the other, because it isn't simple. Another lesson learned is in terms of contact information, that more contact information is not necessarily better. The quality of the contact information is overall more important than how much contact information you have. Next slide, please. Another direction of current development is really increasing our use of person-level sampling. So we're really going in this direction more and more. And the reasons are very many, in fact. One of them is to be able to stratify in order to be able to produce data for underrepresented groups. So when we say data disaggregation, this is what I mean. We're trying to make sure we accurately and sufficiently sample underrepresented groups, such as immigrants, for instance, as I was mentioning, racialized groups, etc. So we want to adjust our sampling plans in order to be able to adequately represent the variety of experiences of Canadians. And this is really pushing us towards using person-level files for our frames. Moreover, if we can avoid first sampling a household and then a person, we can get more efficient sampling designs through a single stage approach. A not inconsiderable aspect is that the person level files that we have fewer out of scope units, so fewer unoccupied dwellings, and that can increase the efficiency of our collection operations overall. In the time of having more and more non-response, having more variables available for non-response adjustments is particularly helpful. And it even helps ease data integration, speed it up in particular, because when we're using person frames, we're pre-linked to administrative data, and so the amount of time needed to integrate administrative data with our surveys is much shorter. Next slide, please. So there are quite a few challenges in terms of heading towards person-level sampling. The first is really that Canada does not have a person register. We're not a country that when you move, you're required to re-register in a new location, for instance. And so developing this kind of frame is a major development initiative. And brings with it privacy concerns that we take really seriously and that we're really looking at very consciously as we're building up files to be able to use for person-level sampling. We use the census quite a bit from that perspective, but it quickly becomes out of date when people move into the country. And so we need to address undercoverage fairly quickly, especially for the immigrant population, which is not only a large part of the Canadian population, but also a population of interest. Moreover, contact information needs to be updated. The amount of time that we spend working on getting contact information while doing sampling is maybe, well, a little bit surprising, but it's a really important step in order to be able to actually get to people, and it's not an easy one. As much as possible, we're looking to combine that census data with administrative data before doing the sampling, so at the frame level rather than at the estimation after having done collection. This really makes for much simpler design in the end, and all of the steps, the post-collection steps of waiting, for instance, are really simplified. So it can increase both the efficiency of the sampling design, but also simplify things in terms of process later on. Next slide, please. So in terms of challenges, and as I was mentioning, what Bertrand had been saying really rang true. One of our main challenges is actually managing response burden. So we're using 3 broad classes of frames, more than 3 actual lists in terms of selecting our samples, and we need to coordinate between them so that we don't target the same people over and over again, and we don't visit the same individuals over and over again. Moreover, as we're moving into sampling individuals directly, we're targeting specific populations more. Parents, for instance, get targeted more, as do certain racialized groups. We often tend to, if someone has been selected, exclude them from a survey that comes up for the next 2 years or so in order to spread out the burden most easily. But as we're targeting subpopulations, this could lead to bias, and at the moment we're really looking at what we can do about that. Next slide, please. In terms of challenges, we are also working with imperfect or incomplete frame information. So we've got really quite useful frames, but as we're adding more and more information onto them, as we're adding social demographic type information, as we're adding extra contact information, we're finding that that information is really, really useful, but it's not quite complete. We don't necessarily have it for everybody who's on the frame. And when we do have it, it can be out of date, or it could simply be not quite right anymore. So we need to update contact information. We need the best information possible, most up to date. In terms of stratification variables, we need allocation methods that efficiently take into account that they're not going to be perfect. For instance, people may move from one group to another, and also that we don't have it for everyone. And so our allocations really need to be adjusted for that. If we wait to have a perfect frame, we're just not going to do our surveys. It's much more productive to use what we've got and try to incorporate it into our designs. Also, one of the things that has come up, especially through the transition to our latest version of the dwelling frames, is that we've got information about how likely a dwelling is to be occupied. But we don't know exactly if a dwelling is occupied, and we have a good number of unoccupied dwellings, seasonal dwellings, for instance. It's not entirely clear how to incorporate this into our sampling design, but it's something that we're really looking at and looking to have solutions on. Next slide, please. Right, so that wraps up what I wanted to say about our frames and how they've been contributing to really improving the designs that we have for our survey. Second part of the talk that I wanted to mention is what we're doing along the lines of less traditional methods. So in terms of less traditional methods, really through the pandemic, we've been trying out a couple new things. First of which, probabilistic web panels. So when I say a probabilistic web panel, what I mean is that we create a pool of willing participants. So we, on our surveys, on our social surveys, ask whether participants are willing to participate in future surveys. And at that time, gather personal phone and email as contact information from those volunteers. We're trying to add this recruitment question really to all surveys in order to have a good pool from which we can contact individuals quickly for really short surveys as a way to get information on emerging needs, sort of last minute type needs. Next slide, please. And here's what we have done in terms of probabilistic web panels so far. So we've had 2 general population web panels. These have web-only collection. So we contact people through email and then they answer online. They're very quick. They can be done within 1 to 2 weeks as a collection period, which is a remarkably quick, given that we're contacting people through email. And these were especially useful at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic when our collection operations were turned upside down and getting to people was quite a challenge. We are also working on 3 targeted population panels at the moment. So at the moment, there's one on racialized populations that are in progress. And there are 2 that are forthcoming, working on Indigenous peoples, working at a panel for Indigenous peoples and for persons with disabilities. So those targeted population panels are recruited from surveys that they themselves use the census as a frame, which is how we can get at these characteristics. In order to ensure better inclusivity, we're using not just a web-based collection strategy, but a web plus a quick phone follow-up as well. So doing collection over a 3-week period, which is still very quick. Next slide, please. So what do we get? Well, the biggest elephant in the room is really what do we have in terms of non-response? These probabilistic panels have many phases to them. You've got the first survey that is run, that it itself has some non-response. From that, you ask for who's willing to participate in more non-response. And then you've got the actual panel survey in which you then again still have some more non-response, giving cumulative response rates from the first sample selected all the way to the respondents for the panel that can be between 3 and 15%. As a methodologist, this gives me pause. So we look at these percentages and go, yeesh. But I have to mention that we do have, because of the way that it's set up, a lot of variables to use in our non-response adjustment. And when we've looked at the issues of bias on our probabilistic web panels, we'll see that we're still in a very different setup than the next non-traditional method that I'll talk about, that are crowdsources. So the method still remains probabilistic. We have a lot of variables to work with. And what we've seen is, in fact, the most consequential of the non-response phases is actually the first survey. That first phase, the panel that's used to recruit the panel, that's the non-response that actually has the biggest impact. Following phases, where you have variables to work with, actually have much less of an impact. Slide, please. We have also been trying out, again, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, in which we were looking at how we can do things quickly, how we can get information in a very constrained type of timeline, using crowdsourcing. So in our context, when I say crowdsourcing, I mean a completely non-probabilistic approach with absolutely no sampling. Just an open portal that is open to participation at large. In order to actually get participation in this context, you need a really effective communication strategy to get the message out that the portal is there. As I alluded to a couple minutes ago, this is not probabilistic. We have highly skewed participant characteristics, many more women, higher educational attainment, fewer younger individuals. And that can be somewhat discouraging, looking at it from the point of view of a survey statistician. But we still have our responsibilities there to provide information about the data quality, to evaluate it and share that information so that users can take it into context. And if possible, produce adjustment factors, so weights, to try to adjust to the degree possible without overstating what we can do in terms of corrections through those methods. Next slide, please. It's important to note that a crowdsource is not fit for all purposes. This is not going to replace our surveys. It is only a quick pulse check to see broadly how things are going, what sort of themes are coming up in terms of what concerns are at the moment. It can be useful if timeliness is an important dimension where you need to get information quickly. And it can be useful if there's no other way to reach the target population. So tomorrow there'll be some ideas how to get to hard to reach population. This can be useful if we don't have a frame that allows us to reach a particular population. But it really depends on the context in which we're working. At the beginning of the pandemic, we ran a lot of crowdsources. Because it was very difficult to get any kind of information, we were quite constrained in that period. Now, it's become much less of a tool to go to, simply because we can get back to regular operations. And we've got options that can get information rather quickly without needing to go to these kinds of methods. One other thing worth noting is that we've looked at using crowdsourcing in combination with probabilistic survey data in order to maybe increase the level of detail we can get out of the probabilistic surveys, these sorts of things. Without giving any of the details, multiple methods for investigating were, multiple methods for combinations were investigated. The biggest challenge that comes out, though, is that all of those methods take time to implement, and the crowdsourcing, given its limitations as a non-probabilistic approach, it's got to be timely in order to be able to sort counterbalance the other dimensions of quality. And so the production time frame makes it difficult to put these kinds of combination methods into practice. Next slide. So that wraps up what I wanted to share. I'm hoping that there'll be questions either now or later on. So merci beaucoup. If you have questions, please feel free to ask or to send me emails later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dylan. Oh yeah, I see people waiting in the waiting room. There are I already saw a few questions. I'm also going to enable mics and cameras. We have a good 30 minutes for Q&A for the first time. Any session meeting I have attended that we have 30 minutes of Q&A. Colleagues, if you have questions, please raise your hand. Mute yourself if you're not speaking, because I hear echoes. No, there are two. I will add my questions later, but there are two questions for you, Celine. One is, do you use adaptive surveys with different probability of non-response? And how do you encourage a person to participate in the web survey? I have a question on the contact. You said we need to really work out how to get the contact information. I know US has been doing a lot with the commercial companies, and maybe Sharon can chip in on that as well.
Well, to start with, I can address the questions that were in the chat. I'll go with, how do you encourage a person to participate in a web survey? We send a lot of emails is one of the basic answers. So for our web panels, over the course of the 3 weeks, so in the targeted panels that we're doing, we will send 5 emails out over the course of 2 weeks and send a text message to the people who have given us cell phone numbers. Each of those invitations and reminders really does generate response all the way to the end. And so we'll send them out generally on Monday and Tuesdays and Thursdays. People are more likely to answer at the beginning of the week than on the weekend. On the weekend, there's just a lot of other things to do. So we look at when to send them out, but basically on those, we send a lot of emails. In terms of our other surveys that aren't necessarily web only, again, we've found sending email reminders to be really useful. But there it'll be more in a mixed mode type of approach, where for the first couple of weeks, we'll send out letters and emails, and subsequently add telephone number, which in itself encourages people to go and answer the questionnaire that's been hanging out on their table. I've been a little bit surprised at how many reminders it seems to be okay to send out that remain effective, but that's what it is, just sending out as many reminders and contacting people as many ways as possible. I'm scrolling back up to see the first question. In terms of adaptive survey designs, different probability of response for households or for different sampling units, yes, to some degree. It really depends on the survey. On surveys that are using person frames, where we have, let's say we're using the census, and so we've got a whole lot of census variables that can help us figure out who is more likely to respond or not. For instance, I've got a survey where we'll see some people are more likely to respond, and halfway through collection, add extra telephone follow-up on the groups that are less likely to respond. So do a temporary non-response adjustment model to see who's likely to respond, and then add extra follow-up, not completely limiting the follow-up to that group, but add extra follow-up to the groups that are less likely to respond. The variables that we see that are most important there, it really doesn't matter too much what model you use to identify them, but the variables are key. Education, age, in the context of surveys aiming specifically at different racialized groups, we found that to be a variable we wanted to look at as well. But it's not all surveys that'll take that approach. Simply because depending on the frame that we're using, when we're using dwelling frame, we don't necessarily have the information necessary to really target non-response follow-up. But we're looking at it more and more because non-response being such an increasing concern, it's important for us to get methods that are as good as possible for it.
Thank you. Anyone would like to speak up? And oh yeah, I have a hand. Ahmadu, would you like to introduce
All right.
yourself and then ask your question?
Yes. Okay, thank you. And thank you for the presentation, really interesting. I think my name is Ahmadu. I'm a statistician at UNHCR. I'm covering Western Central Africa. So the context is a little bit different, I think, from what we have seen as presentation. I'll first start by saying that we all love Sharon's work. I think if I knew I would come with the book today, but anyway, so really great presentation. But my question is basically for Silan. I think you presented something really interesting about the dwellings. And I have a quick question, maybe probably is more a research question. In my region, we don't have really good administrative data, so we cannot do it the way you are doing it. But now with the geospatial information, we have more digitized buildings, for example, the Google buildings, Microsoft, and any other tool. And now with the AI, you have way more data, right, available for everybody, including us. And also, I think if you use the estimation of population that are graded, I think we have a presentation soon on that, you can build something similar to what you have, but not with the same level of precision. And since you have everything in place there, I wonder if there's an opportunity to do some research to see how precise it is with the tools we can use here, because we cannot do what you are doing. But you in Canada, you can do both. You can play with gridded data set. You can also play with list of buildings, mostly for geospatial data, and compare, for example, the result from just this pure geospatial type of sampling in terms of precision and what you use for administrative data, and basically inform and saying, well, maybe we are far off, maybe it's good enough, because you have a lot of places in the world where I think we are not there yet. And I think it will take time really to have something as accurate. So I'm just wondering if there is an opportunity to do some research and see, for example, from places where you have good frame and everything, and that's basically it. But thanks for both presentations. Thank you.
So maybe I can address just some of that without actually being able to give an answer. I won't be able to give an answer. But first is to not exaggerate the degree to which we're there. And I don't think we're actually going to completely ever get there. We're getting more and more information. And yes, we've got frames that I absolutely really, really appreciate. And I appreciate how much information that we have. But it's never going to be perfect. And you were mentioning geospatial information. We've got large portions of the country physically where we're looking at getting that kind of information because we don't have very specific list frames. In the Northern Territories, for instance, we don't have frames. Our frames aren't accurate to the degree that we want. So we could do experiments to see, how efficient different methods are. I don't know how transferable those would be because they're very specific to the context of any individual country. What I would push for is maybe more research in terms of really how to use imperfect information, recognizing that we'll always have this incomplete information or imperfect information on our frame. We're getting more and more information available, but it's never going to be perfect. And so research in that direction, I think, could be useful in both of the contexts that we have.
Thank you, Celine. I hear a couple of things and I see a hand up. So, oh, the hand is gone. Okay, so when calling for experimentation, I hear it's your spatial. I know Dana's in the meeting if you like to come up. And also the question is for Sharon as well with the contact information, how US is, if you have any would like to share the practice from the US and contact information and maybe both of you can address the questions from Bertrand. You have covered a lot, Celine, about you don't when we're out of samples to sample and to talk to what do we do. How do we get the contact information? Maybe also Dana, if you like to speak about the grid and how that can be tested. Maybe if some countries are interested in working together on that. Sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions. Please go ahead. Maybe Sharon, Sharon, are you there? Then we go to Dana after.
Yeah, I'm here mainly to talk about our report. And so one of the things that we mention in our report is the Census Bureau's master address file, which of course they've been working on for years and years and years. And that's the primary source of addresses, contact information for people contacted by surveys conducted by the Census Bureau. But I thought what Celine was saying was extremely interesting about the new crowdsourced surveys, because the Census Bureau also did one of those that it started, in very quick time period after the pandemic started, and it's called the Household Pulse Survey. And I think it had, it's not crowdsourced because it's a probability-based sample, but it has a probability-based sample, but it's was based on very different contact methods than the flagship surveys, such as the American Community Survey. So they were contacting people by email addresses. This excluded a lot of the people in the population. They had a low response rate, and they had a lot of the same challenges as in the probability panels that Celine was talking about. So I actually had a question for Celine here, since everyone else does. And my question was about the crowdsourced surveys. And you mentioned that, that these tend to be preponderantly higher educated people, majority of women. But do you have quality procedures in place that that the people in these surveys are who they claim to be? I mean, would it be possible for people in these surveys to misrepresent themselves?
Quick answer is yes, it would be possible for people to misrepresent themselves, as they can on our regular surveys as well. But I think maybe there might be a greater tendency on the crowdsourced survey in that direction. Looking at the data, it doesn't give us that feeling as you're looking at the data. You sort of see coherent records coming out. Of course, it's something to watch out for, but it's part of the reason that it's not fit for all uses. It's useful as a pulse check to see where things are going, to identify directions that we might need to investigate further, and then to say, okay, let's investigate these in a more sound type of way. It's important to note that some of the information that we were getting back, despite those challenges, still can be useful information and still can be, it sort of passes a smell test as to, okay, does this make sense or not? And from that perspective, I'm thinking of a crowdsource that we did at looking at cannabis prices prior to the legalization of cannabis and then just subsequent to the legalization of cannabis. This wasn't something that we could do probabilistically, asking about things that were illegal just before they'd become legalized. It needed to have a different type of approach. From what I hear, the information that came back was, not necessarily perfect, but most reasonable after you deal with a little bit of outlier detection and things along those lines. So, nope, we're working in a context of all of those challenges, but it's still some sort of like qualitative type information. So I think it can be more put into that range of qualitative type information and interpreted a bit through that lens to be a complement and give an idea of which directions to go in afterwards. But it should not be taken as perfect by any means, because it's far from it.
Dana.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. My name is Dana Thompson, and I work with gridded population data and household surveys, but I also wear a hat working with the modeling of those gridded populations and settlement data. And so I'm much more familiar with the context that Bertrand and Amadou have spoken about, which are places where we might not have administrative frames or household frames, but we're really thinking about just quality area level frames and the use of geospatial data to improve those frames. So I'm super curious. I really appreciated the list of challenges that Bertrand shared, and I was wondering if there was any, Salon had mentioned that there's some shared challenges in Canada, and wasn't sure if you guys wanted to do some brainstorming about how to address, some of the stratification issues that they have, or the remote islands and exclusion of remote areas, and just how to deal with that in a setting where you don't have maybe a household listing readily available, and maybe using an area level frame. I will be speaking in a little while about how we might be using spatial data. Amadou had talked about the household building footprints. And there is a data set that is recently released by the Global Human Settlement Layer, GHSL folks, that's the European Commission Joint Research Center producing that data. They've attempted to classify buildings based whether or not they're residential or non-residential. And it's a very imperfect data set, but I appreciate the direction that we're going in. I think this is doable and will improve as there are advances on the Earth observation side of things. And as there's more data integration between things like OpenStreetMap, and being able to classify different types of buildings and settlements. And when I come to my presentation, I'm going to be doing a shout out, a calls for collaboration. So I've already started taking note of names. I would love to follow up with people to think about how do we actually tackle some of these research questions and methodological questions. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dana. Any questions that we didn't address in the chat, or if you would like to raise hands? I see a question from Boniface. And your response about benchmarking more variables. Maybe our speakers can address that as well.
Yes, thank you. This is Boniface from Uganda. I'm a statistician. I saw a bullet that talks about increasing the number of variables to address the issues of non-responses. So I was wondering how increasing the number of variables would address the non-response cases, because I just cited an example. If I'm trying to draw a conclusion from a sample from a population of about 2,000, and by calculations, I'm required to reach out to a minimum of 200, and then due to non-responses, I only reached out to 100 or 150. And because the number is not good enough to do the significant test, then adding more variables wouldn't really address the non-response cases. So I only cited, maybe if we were using those questions for triangulation purposes, like maybe we are using date of birth and then the age. If someone responded to the date of birth without responding to the age, then I can use that information to really replace the non-response on questions basis, not really overall respondents missing the questions. And I also had a quick feedback. Maybe and someone talked, the presenter talked about the dwelling. I was wondering, sometimes after we have sampled a household, you might find within the households you have about 5 people who are eligible to be asked the questions. So the question is, how do you again sample from the list of those who are eligible? Because I've seen in some surveys, people just, out of the 5, they just go and like, I'm going to talk to the elder person because the person is more informed. So I'm wondering if that is also addressed in your methodology, because you might end up affecting the quality of the survey. Yeah. And then in terms of the data collection fatigue, where you're gathering data from the same people over and over, where you now said you're going to collect data on a rotational basis. So now that brings in the element of sampling without replacement. So sometimes people use different method, but the method used is not aligned with the analysis, because the analysis you'll use if you sample with replacement is different from the analysis you'll use if you sample with replacement. So I don't know whether that is also factored in. Thank you. That's my feedback.
Maybe I can address some of that. I'm glad we have time for questions. It's really, it's fun to hear about experiences and see how common, how much we have in common. First, on the extra variables side of things, there's 2 ways in which we try to get at it. The more variables we can have on the frames, so that when we're looking at person level sampling, oftentimes then we can get more variables on the frames. That's always our preferred method, because then you can put it in from the get-go in terms of non-response adjustment or calibration totals that you can get at, but you really have it on the frame, so you have it available for everyone. It really increases the possibilities of what you can do. Even if we don't have it on the frames, though sometimes it's very useful to put it into the questionnaire and ask the variables as well, and then afterwards calibrate to specific totals. So I'm thinking about education in particular. We don't always have that variable on our frames, but in our context, it's one that's quite informative in terms of who participates in our surveys or not. So we will use, on some of the surveys, use that in our calibration, even if we can't put it into our non-response adjustments. Just a little bit of background. The weighting methods that we tend to use involve first a step for out of scope correction, a non-response adjustment, followed by some calibration that's there both to sort of complete the non-response adjustment that we want to do, and for coherence between different surveys. So we use it sort of across the board. There's not just one answer to what we have, but the more information we have, the more possibilities for where we can use them. Second question asked about how we select one person in the household. Again, that varies. We have some surveys in which we will ask the person most knowledgeable. You were asking about an elder who had the most information. If we're asking about housing conditions, for instance, whether houses need repairs, things along those lines if we're asking about finances, and we'll ask the person who actually knows the most about it. If we're doing a sample where we really want to get a picture of how individuals are doing rather than the whole household, then we'll select one person, either having done a roster and then randomly selecting within the questionnaire, within the time the questionnaire is administered, or we'll also do something called age order, or that we call age order sampling, where we will pre-pick whether you want to ask the oldest person or the youngest person or the second oldest person or the second to youngest person. We'll pre-pick which of these people that we want to use and then ask to get that person in particular in order to be as close to evenly picking any eligible household member. But that's tricky because those instructions are not necessarily easy to follow, and those instructions aren't necessarily, it's not necessarily obvious why it's important to follow those instructions either. So we've been looking at improving the ways at which we administer those questions to get the right person more often.
The line pre-pick, so you don't give the freedom to the enumerators, interviewers in the field, right? You have to no replacement. You don't pick the easiest one.
And pre-pick, and when we have an interviewer, the interviewers understand how important that is because we've talked to them about it, about how important that is. But the hardest instance is we're getting more and more self-response. And not everyone's a methodologist. Not everyone will understand, oh, it's important that I get the second oldest person. Those types of instructions aren't necessarily obvious to self-respondents. And so we're seeing that we need ways, even for self-response, we can put it in the letter, but to confirm that we've got the right person. And if we don't, to say, oh, can you go get the right person? And there's ways of improving the accuracy of that. But definitely a random selection and a pre-done selection.
Any other questions? Do you have a list of replacement to be ready?
Hello?
I saw it from, yes.
I just want to add that in some surveys, you can say that the one who has the closest birthday, he or she will be selected. So I just want to add that when you have many individuals, in some cases, like if you're talking of reproductive health, then you will choose the women and things like, so it has to be predefined. Thanks.
Ramesh, is that Ramesh? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Ramesh, yeah. So, you know, the question from Uganda was that when there are
correlated
5,
with some of our survey variables.
Yeah, so I'm just adding to the Silan's response that closest birthday, like the American Community Survey or some of the surveys, we can do that.
Yeah, I think that's really quite good. My only worry is always when you're sending different researchers in the field and then different people are probably doing different things, then the bit of the consistency. So that's why I'm saying if that's the approach you're going to use, it's good to be written in the protocol so that the 10 different people will go and then select uniformly.
It has to be
we're going towards
determined.
We're going towards adding confirmation questions in our questionnaires to verify how often we really get the right person and to push people to actually using the right person. It seems to be fairly easy to nudge people in the direction of actually having the right person answer just by asking about it and thereby emphasizing that it's important.
Thank you. Any other? I saw a question about mobile phone numbers. What about people's experiences of collecting and using mobile phone numbers to contact respondents? Any other question? The hands up from Gareth. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Gareth Mitchell from STITS New Zealand. I had a couple of questions. One for Sharon. So you noted you kind of saw alternative data sources playing a role to kind of complement surveys. And I was just curious about whether you saw a dramatic reduction in the level of surveying as greater use is made of multiple data sources. And then for Celine, I was really curious about the move to person-based sampling combined with using kind of greater kind of linked admin data, and if you had any comments on sort of respondent kind of pushback on how they are selected in the sample when you're kind of contacting them with a name, an address, or an email.
Sharon, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you for that question. So to date, there has not been a big diminution in terms of the number of surveys in the United States. And I think it's highly dependent on the subject matter because some information, so for example, earnings records of people's are collected, in Social Security Administration data. And some of that information might be used to replace some of the information in surveys. And I believe Statistics Canada has done work at using tax records to replace some of the information that was collected in surveys. But I think in other instances, there's really no way to collect information other than in a survey. So if we're collecting information about attitudes, about people's individual levels of health, about their experiences with criminal victimization, I don't see a way to replace that information with administrative data, although I think that we can supplement some of that information and get additional variables from administrative data for those circumstances, but I don't see replacing those surveys.
Sharon, I completely agree with you on that front. I can give detail about what we've done on the income front. We will link individuals to their tax records. We started by asking if people wanted to skip over a section of the questionnaire where we'd ask about income. And yes, most people wanted to, the vast majority of people wanted to skip all the income questions and have us go get that information directly, and found that in the context of that particular subject matter, the detail that we could get, the level of accuracy of the data was so much better when we linked to administrative data sources that it sort of far outweighed the lack of linkage for some part of the population that we'll deal with through imputation. So we've gotten a lot of success on that one, and it's been I'd say probably 20 years now since we sort of started on that path, and it's a very fruitful path in that direction. As for the question of what kind of sort of pushback we're getting when we send out letters with names, there's really two versions of that. We'll actually maybe slightly get more response slightly quicker in personally addressed mail, because when you send it out to a direct person, I don't know, it takes on a little bit more importance. Someone's a little bit more likely to open up a letter that's addressed to them personally rather than to the household, which makes it seem like, that can wait. So we'd expect a little gain in terms of efficiency when addressing letters personally, and haven't really received much in the way of feedback, at least not more than when we address letters to households. So on the individual level, it doesn't seem to be much of a concern. The broader concern comes actually not from individuals who've been selected, but from people who are watching what's going on, who are watching the way that we use administrative data and how we set up programs to make sure that what we've done is clear. And we've been working with the Privacy Commissioner in order to make sure that our approaches to using administrative data and our approaches in setting up frames are appropriate. So it's more at a global level that those concerns are brought up and then addressed. I don't know if that makes much sense, but that's sort of the experience that we've been having.
Awesome, thanks for that.
Thank you. We have 3 more minutes. Any other questions from the floor, from the chat? There was a question about phone surveys. Was it about the frame? And Paul Smith, there's a hand up. One question. And Boniface after. And that's it, no more questions. So we get our break.
Yes, thank you again. I was trying to look at the other approach of the area sampling. So I've in the past used the lots quality assurance sampling approach, where you cluster the different areas into supervision areas and you try to sample about a number of 19 sampling units. There are different numbers that we can really use for drawing statistical analysis. So I was just asking, maybe from the team that have been innovating on the area sampling approach, have they tried to research on the lots quality assurance sample, and then also from the side of the analysis? I think my disappointment always as a statistician comes from the angle that every time people use different sampling approach, but when it comes to the analysis, they're using the same formulas for the analysis. For example, someone might use multi-stage, another one use stratified, but when it comes to analysis, all of them get to what is my nominator and what is my denominator, then just get the proportion multiplied by 100, and then they report on the percentages. So basically about the experience and then how the analysis is linked to the lots quality assurance, in case you've done it. Thank you.
We can't hear you. You're muted again.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you. So maybe we take the question from Paul and then you can respond together. Paul, do you still have your question, or I saw your hand up? Okay, please go ahead. We can't hear you. Can we? Can I? Is that me? No, we cannot hear you. Yes.
Yeah, now it should work.
Yeah.
Great. Sorry. Yeah, I was connected to a funny device which didn't actually pick up my voice. I was interested in the person level sampling, which is Silan is talking about. There are all sorts of interesting ethical things, but I'm quite interested in what happens when you actually send a letter to people and they're not at the address you think they are. Is that all caught up in the non-response follow-up with emails, and how much does that kind of thing really happen?
So we're actually gaining experience slowly on that front. We're not necessarily at the point of being able to answer it. So in fact, I'm as curious as you are for a large part of it. We do know that we have to increase the budgets associated with tracing people. Emails in particular are useful because someone will sometimes receive the email and then, having found, because we'll send something to a mailing address with the information of how to complete the questionnaire. But because we don't know that the email will necessarily get to the right person, since we have an email for the household and not the person, we just send reminders. So someone might get the reminder and then contact us, and then we're able to trace and then associate them to the right place. But yes, maybe in a couple of years, I'll have an answer that we can say more about how to efficiently do those bits. But it seems like the gains and efficiencies that we're going to get are going to be greater than addressing that challenge at trying to find the person. The other thing that I can add is that we do use administrative sources to try to follow the person and find a new address if they've, for instance, updated their address on tax forms, for example, or on driver's license forms, without being able to really follow everyone and see where they are. we are able at times to update that address.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, and for the question on
yeah.
lots quality assurance sampling, I'm actually just not familiar with that specifically, and so I don't have anything worth saying on that front, unfortunately. But I'm glad to have questions raised so I can have a look at them afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thanks. Huge thanks to all the speakers and our audience who raised great questions. So with that, I would like to call a short break, coffee break. So we will resume 11 o'clock, and Sharon will be chairing the next session. 11.
Thank you very much for your questions. I look forward to being able to share throughout the next sessions as well.
Thank you.
So hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your coffee break. And in this session, we are going to continue some of the themes from the last session and talk about some recent developments on sample frames and listing. So we'll hear from both of the speakers in this session first, and then there will be opportunity for questions and discussion at the end. You can type questions into the chat at any time, or you can save them to ask yourself during the discussion. So I'd like to just get going by having a brief introduction of the speakers. Full information about their qualifications, characteristics is going to be available on the website for this meeting. And our first speaker is Kasum Dianou, who is a PhD student in demography at the Catholic University of Louvain, who will speak on exploring mobile phone survey approaches as alternatives to face-to-face surveys in crisis settings. So I'll just turn it over to the speaker. Let's get going.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'm pleased to join this working group to present my research on mobile phone survey in low and middle income countries. Can we go to the next, please? Okay, so it's well known that vital registration is the ideal data source for regular monitoring of demographic phenomena at different geographic and administrative level at a relative low cost. However, in most low and middle income countries, the completeness of civil registration remain too low to accurately estimate demographic indicator. So demographic indicator in these regions are therefore mostly derived from retrospective surveys and census. These nationwide collection operations are generally conducted face-to-face, and these are very infrequent, and that they does not provide up-to-date information. Next. Despite the development of IT tools and the diversification of communication channel, few countries has explored alternative form of data collection on mortality. And the pandemic has since highlighted the limitation of face-to-face data collection at a time when up-to-date information was sorely needed. Data collection through face-to-face survey is also difficult to implement in other crisis settings, such as event of a natural disaster, conflict, or insufficient resource in terms of time and resource. There is therefore a need, next please. There is therefore a need to develop faster, cheaper, lighter and more flexible data collection method for estimating demographic indicator. And new possibility can be explored with the recent increase in cell phone network coverage and use. Next. So what do you know about mobile phone survey? The literature show that they have several advantages that make them promising tools for data collection in general. These methods are less expensive, quicker to deploy, can be conducted at higher frequency, allow flexibility in questionnaire design. However, there are some limitations such as sampling and non-sampling bias, selection bias, lower response rates, network quality is sometimes problematic in some countries, and the ability of interviewer to establish a trusting relationship. In sub-Saharan Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, there has been a proliferation of mobile phone survey in recent years. However, these are often small scales, such as opinion surveys. It's also used to evaluate health intervention in with specific population, or tracking a certain demographic event in health and demographic surveillance system, or to measure the impact of Ebola or COVID-19 crisis on household living conditions and access prevention behaviors. However, few studies have compared the quality and reliability of data obtained from face-to-face survey and mobile phone survey, or examine the differences between the sampling method in the in-phone survey. Nice. So the aim of our research is to assess the feasibility of household data collection through telephone call and identify the most suitable approach for use in developing countries. So we will focus our research on representativeness of the sample, the respondent characteristic of mobile phone respondent, and data quality in terms of age, shaping, and call outcome. Next, please. So we use RAMS data, and RAMS is an innovative survey program designed to estimate excess mortality caused by COVID-19 pandemic in 5 middle and low-income countries such as DRC, Malawi, Mozambique, Bangladesh, and Burkina Faso. So in Burkina Faso, the data collection started on September 2021 and ended in October 2022. And the sample include respondents ages 15 years and above, residing in Burkina Faso at the time of the survey. Interviews were conducted by mobile phone, and response were recorded on a tablet using survey CTO. Participation was anonymous, and all subjects included in this study gave verbal informed consent to participate before the interview. Data collection was based on quarterly cross-sectional survey organized over a period of 12 months. This strategy made it possible to avoid the introducing bias due to seasonality in mortality. So we use two sample strategy. A sample of approximately 6,000 individuals based on number retrieved from a face-to-face survey called Harmonized Survey of Household Living Conditions. In French, enquête harmonisée sur les conditions de vie des ménages. And the second, we use 9,000 individuals obtained by randomly drawing telephone number, commonly called random digit dialing. We will refer to these two subsamples as the ESCVM arm and the RDD arm, respectively. The purpose of using these two sampling procedure was to test the selectivity of respondents and the possible variation in data quality depending on how respondents were recruited. Next. So here we present the composition of mobile phone survey sample and provide a comparison with the characteristic of the population enumerated in the 2019 census. For the ISWGHS study arm, we compare our sample with the population of heads of household in the census, while our comparator for the RDD sample is the population ages 15 to 64-year-old. So we found several notable differences between the national population and our unweighted sample. So first, while rural respondents made up nearly 43 and 63% of the ISWM and RDD sample, they represent 69% of the national population of head of household and the same percentage of adult ages 15 to 64-year-old in the census. Second, the population without any formal education were underrepresented by at least 20 percentage points in each study arm. And third, the proportion of population residing in the small household counting less than 9 members was lower in our sample compared to the national population in the census, even though our sample overrepresented the urban population. Next. We also saw here a comparison of the characteristic of the mobile phone survey for the ISWM arm with those of head of household with cell phone in the original face-to-face survey. So compared to the cell phone owner in the face-to-face survey, the population re-interviewed by telephone in 2021-2022 is found to be younger, better educated, more urban, more concentrated in larger household and in households that are better equipped in terms of electricity, roof type, or water access. Next. Okay. In this table, we present the phone call outcome rate by study arm using the final disposition code established by the American Association for Public Opinion Research. We obtain with this result higher response rates, higher cooperation rates, and higher contact rate in the ISWM study arm, in which the respondent had previously been interviewed face-to-face compared to the RDD approach. With this ISWM study arm, we need around 2 phone numbers to complete a questionnaire. By contrast, for the RDD approach, we need around 4 telephone numbers to complete a questionnaire. The response rate was 45% in the RDD arm against 59%, 59% in the ISWM arm. So the low response rate, especially in the RDD arm, is largely explained by people who do not pick up call from interviewer. The vast majority of eligible people who respond to the calls participate in the interview. 84% and 90% respectively for the RDD and ISWM arm. Refusal rates were low and similar for the two arms, around 6 to 7%. The time needed to finalize an interview was longer with the ISWM arm compared to the RDD arm. So this may be because respondents in the ISWM-based survey arm are reacting to the fact that some questions were already asked in the original face-to-face survey. We also analyzed audio recording and noticed that for many of basic questions asked, some respondents from the ISWGHS branch interrupt the interview to remind the interviewer that they already had this information when interviewer visited the household in the original face-to-face survey. We also analyze the quality of age reporting using the Myers index. This attraction index can be interpreted as an estimate of the percentage of people whose ages would need to be corrected to erase the attraction on certain ages. So this index reaches 18% in the ESWM arm against 53% in the RDD arm, due reflecting a more pronouncing hipping on certain ages in the RDD arm. The Whipple index confirm this and highlight the more frequent attraction for round digit in the RDD arm. When compared this index with those calculate from census data, we noticed a similar quality of age declaration in the census and the ESVM arm, but a stronger attraction for round digit in the RDD arm. Next. So in summary, we can say that mobile phone survey has proven to be a feasible and acceptable alternative method when face-to-face data collection is not possible. Nice. However, this method has some important limitation with implication for obtaining a representative sample and estimating certain demographic phenomena. The absence of supplementary information regarding customer socio-demographic characteristics adds complexity to the sampling process. And the place from which respondents participate in the interview is difficult to be controlled. Next. And the telephone survey involved the use of fairly short questionnaire because we cannot exceed 15 minutes with the respondents. Next. And the response rate were much lower than what predicted for this survey. Next, please. So despite this limitation, it's possible to carry out a large-scale national survey in Burkina Faso and in sub-Saharan Africa from a sample of number randomly generated mobile phone number or from the pre-registered number during a face-to-face survey collects information. The result of our analysis also suggests that the method relying on pre-collected number had higher data quality than the RDD. So for further research, we suggest the use of quota sampling. Next, please. The use of quota sampling strategy and the use of pre-registered number during a face-to-face survey. A good communication strategy to inform the population is also needed because some people say, okay, we do not understand about this survey. And further research is underway to better understand the challenge and opportunity associated with the use of mobile phone survey. We especially focused on monitoring mortality level and trend. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. And I think this presentation helped answer some of the questions we had in the last session about the use of mobile phones to reach populations. So we'll have questions for this at the end of the session. Let's move on to our second speaker. And this is Dana Thompson. who is, as it says at the bottom, a pioneer in the field of gridded population sampling. And she will talk to us today, giving us just a broad overview of what gridded population sampling is and how it differs from typical census-based surveys in terms of methods, tools, and data. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Sharon, and thanks so much, Hoy, for organizing this session. That is absolutely correct. That's what I'm going to do today is talk about a manual that came out just under a year ago on designing and implementing gridded population surveys. And it's the first manual that is kind of a generalized tool set for folks who want to implement a gridded population survey. We are joined today in the audience is Dale Rhoda, who edited this publication. So thanks, Dale, for being here, and maybe he can jump in with answering some questions. Next slide, please. So I'll talk very briefly about what is gridded population sampling, who's using it for what purposes, when is it appropriate and not appropriate, what tools you might use, and the state of the field. Next, please. So if you're not familiar with what a gridded population data set is, it's a model of the population, a model of the estimated count of people in tiny little grid cells. And any survey which is using these estimated population counts to derive a sample frame would be considered a gridded population survey. So gridded population data sets can be turned into sample frames in a couple of different ways. One is that we could use the grid cells directly, either at the scale or resolution which they were generated. So a typical gridded data set nowadays has estimates in about 100 by 100 meter grid cells. That's about the size of a city block. You can also aggregate to larger, say 200 by 200 meters or 1 by 1 kilometer. And there are some teams that are doing this, choosing a grid cell size that more or less works for an urban context and a grid cell size that more or less works for a rural context. But as you can imagine, you end up with quite a bit of variability of people per sampling unit. And that can, of course, introduce a lot of design effect into and a lot of variance into the estimates. More commonly, you see the gridded population grid cells aggregated into units of approximately similar total population with varying areas. And so those might be gridded units that are got these blocky boundaries that don't align with natural features in the real world. Or you can actually aggregate to, say, your old census sampling unit boundaries if they've been georeferenced. There's also a tool that's been being developed for quite some time. I'm hopeful that it'll come out later this year. It's called Pre-EA. A team, WorldPop at University of Southampton is working on this to use roads and river information from OpenStreetMap, major roads and rivers, to create what are uncrossable features, and then using other natural boundaries within those units to generate little tiny shapes that and aggregate them into units of similar total population and use those as a sample frame. I'll talk more about these two in a minute. Next slide, please. So here's the landscape of off-the-shelf available gridded population data sets. My focus, as I mentioned earlier, is in lower and middle income country context. So there are a few additional data sets that might be available for Europe only or North America only. But these are the ones that we normally are working with household surveys. And generally, I've organized them in the top left is the least accurate and least useful for survey and other fieldwork. And the bottom right tends to be more useful and more accurate. Next, please. So keep going. If we'll just get through all the 2 more clicks, please. Thank you. That's good. Back. So I don't have if you could go back, please. I don't have time in this presentation to talk through all of the methodologies behind these gridded population estimates, but do check out the manual. I've got a URL on the last slide. And I tried to use plain language to describe the different modeling techniques behind these gridded data sets. What you're seeing here is the same area zoomed in of Lagos on the waterfront. And you'll see the pictures are very widely. So the first takeaway is that not all gridded population data sets are equal. They are very different models behind them, and they are designed for very different purposes. And so only some of them are really useful for field work. I'm going to be, next week, I'm joining a team at Columbia University called CSUN, and they produce the gridded population of the world. It's the top left corner. And it's really raw census data that's been gridded. And that is actually a data input to 5 or 6 of these other gridded population products. So I would never recommend the GPW data set to use directly for fieldwork, but some of the other data sets I would. Now, there's been huge progress and innovation in this field over the last few years. And so all of the ones that don't have marks on them, Landscan HD, World Pop Constrained, HRSL, GHS Pop, World Pop Peanut Butter, and Grid 3, all of these data sets have come out in just the last 2 to 3 years. And they're all much better than what was previously available to us for surveys, which was Landscan Global and the World Pop Unconstrained model data sets. So the vast majority of gridded population surveys to date have actually used the two that I have warning symbols on, and there was a lot of success in these. I've used the World Pop Unconstrained and Landscan for gridded population surveys, and they were reasonably accurate and worked and resulted in very reasonable probabilistic surveys. But it's just to say that there's much better data that's much more accurate at finer resolution nowadays. Next slide, please. So in late 2020, Dale and I and some colleagues did a full literature review of which gridded data sets or which gridded population surveys have been conducted to that date. So if you don't mind clicking forward. In late 2020, this was the distribution of counts of surveys that had been conducted in low and middle income countries by the type of survey implementer. So we've got 32 surveys that had been implemented by opinion pollsters. These are like Gallup Poll, ORB International, RTI International, and very few that had been national government routine multi-topic surveys like mixed DHS or LSMS. Only one survey had been conducted and I had been involved with that. It was a mixed survey. There's been a couple of surveys that have been done for the purpose of evaluating gridded population surveys or for evaluating programs, so evaluation and research surveys. And a few surveys, one of which I have an example of to do rapid needs assessments, so World Food Program, for example. If you want to see more about those surveys, follow the URL there to the article. If you click forward, please. I just want to flag that the opinion polls, many of them are redone every single year. So Gallup poll, for example, is done every year, and they're adding more countries that use a gridded population sample frame each year. So the number of total surveys that have been conducted is probably well over 100 at this point. Next slide. So there are a number of cases when gridded population sampling is not appropriate. Feel free to click through all the bullets here. If you are in a country that has recently conducted a census and that census is reasonable quality and widely trusted, definitely use that as a sample frame because it's field referenced. So gridded population data sets are modeled and there's always going to be some level of model error. Also, if you have a really small coverage area, a neighborhood or just a part of a city, there's much better ways to derive a sample frame than using these modeled estimates. Most of the models are done at the national for a national scale, and so there's going to be error at very local scale. And another situation when I would not recommend gridded population sampling is if your survey team really does not have regular internet or enough bandwidth to render things like Google Maps or Google Earth, because gridded population surveys all, no matter what approach you use or set of tools you use, all involve some kind of reality check of the sampling units before you go to the field using some kind of satellite imagery. And things like Google Earth and Google Maps require internet bandwidth to render those images. Also, if you're working with a team that really doesn't feel comfortable, if your survey managers are really not comfortable with those tools, then you probably don't want to use a gridded population sample. But other than that, if you click forward, there's a lot of situations when gridded population sampling can be very useful. The most common one by far is when the census is grossly outdated or inaccurate or just not trusted. So for example, in Nigeria, there's been 5 or 6 censuses since independence, and they're all hotly contested. And so gridded population surveys have been an attractive alternative because the gridded population estimates are thought to, by some, even in the National Statistical Agency, to have a better distribution of the population at local scale. And what we find, so a lot of the gridded population data products out there are actually using the last census as inputs, and it's disaggregating that information to these little tiny grid cells. But what we find is that even if the input data is quite outdated, we can project forward the population growth using some really kind of crude numbers from UN stats. And then we can disaggregate that based on lots of physical features in the real world. So all of these models are using things like building footprints now, land cover type, the presence of roads and other infrastructure. And so it's going to distribute people, the distribution of the population within census units is often much more accurate than the outdated census itself. And so you can actually get pretty good distribution of a population and therefore more accurate samples out of a gridded population data set. It will never be perfect, but it's usually better than your alternative. Also, there's 2 cases when a design that I'm calling area microcensus designs. I think this design has gone by other names like segment sampling, but where you interview all people in a tiny area. And there's 2 situations when this can be really useful. So one is when you need to do one field visit because the context you're working in is dangerous and you want to reduce the risk for your field workers. And so you can use those tiny little grid cells as a way of segmenting an area and use those to do an area microcensus design. Also, if you're working in a setting where you have very dynamic population, super complex living arrangements, I'm thinking of Kathmandu, Nepal, Dhaka, Bangladesh, any setting where there is massive population growth from in-migration and huge mobility, you probably are not getting very good listings when you do a typical multi-stage sample because your listers are going to have only a few minutes at each structure to ask about how many households are there. They're probably only going to hear about the legally registered households, and they're not going to hear about households that might be sharing a dwelling unit but are not on the lease, or households that are tucked behind in very unconventional living arrangements or living inside of the shop that they run. So if you're interested in these kind of hidden households, it can be valuable to use an area microcensus design where your interviewers are basically doing all the enumeration at the same time that they're interviewing, and they have time to build that rapport with respondents. They're spending 2+ hours doing the interview, and they start to hear about those informally settled households. And so that's another interesting use case for gridded population surveys. And finally, if you need to stratify your whole sample frame on some kind of geographic characteristic, I'm thinking of climate zones or air quality for health survey. I've seen like air quality bands being used to stratify. These won't follow a typical administrative boundary, and so you might want to stratify based on some external geographic characteristic, and you always have a geographic sample frame if you're working with a gridded population data set, so that can be a benefit. Next slide, please. So many of us will be familiar with a typical multi-stage or two-stage full listing approach, or similarly a two-stage where there's a random walk in the field to identify sample households. Generally, we're stuck with the two-stage random walk if we need to go into the field for one visit. We have like a security issue or a budget issue. At the two-stage full listing approach can be super expensive, but it does give us the robust sampling weights that we often need for national statistics or program evaluation. What's cool about the area microcensus designs, whether you do it in one stage or two stage, is that you're doing a full listing at the same time that you're interviewing. And so you can actually calculate your robust sample weights, but you might only need one field visit. And so here's an example from the World Food Program. They really introduced this idea to me. They took a gridded population sampling unit that was comprised of a few cells. I think that they were targeting 100 households their sampling units had approximately 100 households each. And they wanted to interview something like 12 or 15 households in each sampling unit. So they decomposed their sampling unit into the underlying grid cells and randomized the grid cells. Red was the one that the field worker would visit first, and they would interview all households and enumerate at the same time all households in that cell. If they hadn't reached the target of 12 households per cluster, they went to the second randomized cell, which is the orange one, and then the yellow one. And this is basically a form of quota sampling, but you have a full enumeration of all the households in the segments that you visited. And so you might be looking at this map thinking, how on earth do you deal with all of the buildings that are intersected by a boundary? There's a really simple field protocol. Normally, I recommend the north and east edges. If the building is intersected on the north and east edges, they are included in the cell. And if they are on the west or south edge, then they are excluded from the cell. And this will always ensure that a structure only belongs in one cell, no matter where you are on the grid. So implementing a gridded population survey is not always as challenging as we initially think. And this was a really clever way to use an area microcensus design, kind of with quota sampling, but resulting with robust sampling weights and one field visit. Next slide, please. So if you're wondering how to create a sample frame from a gridded population data set, there's two tools that are out there at the moment. And one of my calls for collaboration is to see if we might put together a grant to actually just create sample frames from gridded population data and do that together. If you're okay with these gridded boundaries, there's a tool in R that runs on its own called Grid EZ or Grid EZ. And this has also been built into a tool that I worked on when I was working at FlowMinder Foundation called gridsample.org. Unfortunately, that tool is going to be taken offline sometime soon, but it groups cells into areas of approximately similar population with a maximum area constraint. And here's an example of a real Grid EZ sample frame from an HIV/AIDS survey among refugees in Uganda from last year. There's also a picture here of a sample frame that's generated through a tool called Pre-EA. It's a QGIS plugin. Like I said, it will be released probably later this year, maybe next year. Unfortunately, I've had the pleasure of being able to use it. The challenge is it requires a lot of data processing of the spatial data that has to go into this, like of the roads and rivers. And so in talking with Dale and some other folks in the survey world, I think that the next step is, rather than generating tools for creating sample frames, that we just work with the gridded population producers and try to just generate sample frames just as a data product that we can download from online. So that'll be one of my calls for action. Next slide, please. So where are we at in the field of gridded population surveys? Can you just click through all the extra text on this slide? So the current tools for designing and implementing gridded population surveys are quite piecemeal. And I do my best in the manual to provide kind of like which constellation of tools would you want to piece together for your particular survey design, your survey context, and the skill sets that your team has. If you are not an advanced programmer or you don't use GIS, you can actually still do a gridded population survey. There are tools available and you can kind of piecemeal something together. So the website has links to a series of tutorials that can be combined into basically a field manual if you so desire. But I think there's still a need to build more integration among the tools that are out there that are tailored for these type of surveys. The underlying data sets, the gridded population data sets, are kind of the biggest the weakest link in the chain, in my view. Not having accuracy at the scale that we need for household surveys is the biggest challenge. There is a lot of improvement happening right now. I spend a lot of time thinking about high density, low income urban, slum contexts. There is just all of the models right now do not do a very good job of estimating total population counts in those types of areas. And so that to me is always like something to think about. But we also don't do a very good job in census of enumerating those populations often. So this is an evolving field. I think one huge benefit to linking this community who are in the field, often doing full enumerations of people in small areas, and the gridded population world, which is the other hat that I wear, is I think there can be a real symbiotic relationship that we can possibly use the field enumerations that we're doing to not only validate the gridded data sets that are available off the shelf, but possibly think about how do we train better models so that we have better data to work with in the near future. So that will be another call for collaboration. Finally, I think the area microcensus designs are super promising, but there are some real big questions still remaining. We don't know what design effects would look like because there's really not been many surveys using this approach. I think that there are some data sets out there that we could run simulations on to start generating some initial information around what design effects would look like and the kind of ideal sample designs for an area microcensus approach, but we do need to develop an evidence base there. So I think the next is my last slide. And what I was going to do is actually pop my few kind of areas for collaboration into the chat. I would be so appreciative if you could give a thumbs up or thumbs down if you think that this is an important question. And if you could reply to it with any ideas or even your contact information if you want to collaborate on these. Like I said, I'm starting a new job next week and I will be putting together some grant proposals and would love to collaborate with the survey world and link with the gridded population world. So those are my 4 areas for collaboration. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Dana. So let's open it up for questions for both speakers in here. I'll start off. We have a question for our first speaker in the chat regarding mobile phone surveys. And the question reads, we employed computer-assisted telephone interviews for quality assurance of data, but we faced a lot of non-response and non-cooperation. People refused to talk due to their busy schedule. What do you think should be done in these cases? So, Kasum, do you have some thoughts on that?
Okay, I have already responded to this person. In this instance, we schedule appointment with them at their preferred dates and time, as long as it falls within the investigate period.
So are there other questions in here? So I saw, yes, Amadou, please.
All right, thanks. And thank you for the presentation. I think it was really interesting. Probably jump on your.
Yeah, but
I don't hear you.
I think you muted.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I hope you can hear me. So I say it was really, 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 really interesting, and probably jump on what you said, Dana, on collaboration and what we can do probably in the future. I'm a statistician at UNHCR. With few colleagues, we had a project with WorldPop, working on pre-years, basically adapting the tools for the context of refugees, but also forced displacement in general, so including IDPs in some context. And I think, as you know, one of the biggest challenges is first modeling the population, having a good gridded model, which is not always easy, particularly with the data we have as input. So I think definitely we love to improve. We have worked with the team working on a PEA, Sarchill, and edit on the modeling for the World Pop and Southampton Uni. So, but I think it would be good to also have a discussion with you, I think, and regarding how we can move from here. I'm particularly interested in your project, in the project in Uganda. If you can maybe tell us more about, the process. It was the pre-EA or the grid easy, and did you have a specific model for the refugee population there? But basically, I'm happy to send you an email with more, context about what we did, what we are doing, and what we want to do in the future. There's a lot of things we didn't finish to do. We still want to continue to work with them. It was really, as you said, it's really, really, really interesting to see what we can do, all this geospatial data, particularly in our context where we don't have too much in terms of good quality sampling frame. So thanks again for the presentation.
I don't have any particular follow-up to that other than those are all folks that I've worked with before. I would love to continue talking about gridded population surveys, but if you wouldn't mind, if I could jump in a little bit on the mobile phone survey and maybe hear some of Kasum's experience and response, because one of my previous roles was with Flowminder Foundation, which does mobile phone surveys and working with mobile phone data to model population mobility. And my role on that team initially was because of all of the bias that exists inside of our mobile phone data as sample frames, was a big open question of like, how do we, do we need a household survey person that can help us adjust for some of these? And so I think this is where my train of thought was, but I'd really love to hear if there's been other trains of thought. So my train of thought was that you really can't do a representative probabilistic sample unless you have some basic field data. And our thinking was that you would need to have some kind of count of SIMs per household, because SIMs is really like the sample frame that you have with a mobile phone survey. It's the card inside of the phones. And some people, in a lot of contexts, there's like a reason to have more than one SIM that you use in your phone because, this company has a plan that you can call your mom, and this company has a plan that's useful for work. So people have multiple SIMs with different companies. And so having a household survey that actually gives you a count of SIMs per person or per household at least would be really important. And some basic demographics of who has access to those SIMs, because women, for example, might have much more limited access to a SIM. They might not be the main user, or it might be younger people who are the main user. So that was one thing we talked about, and maybe basically deriving post-stratification weights based on a field survey that somehow gives you information about the SIM data. So that's one issue. And then we did also talk about how to, at least in the Flowminder context, there was often an agreement with one mobile phone provider. So like Vodafone, for example, and you would sample from their list of SIMs, registered SIMs. And the question was, can we differentiate people? Obviously, we have a geography, so there's a bunch of metrics that tell you the likely location, like which cell phone tower the person is closest to during the nighttime hours, and most likely kind of the general location of their residence. So there's some geographic information that's easy to get from the mobile phone company. But they were also looking at how to group people by economic strata, and the number of top-ups and the frequency of the frequency of top-ups and the amount of top-ups was strongly correlated with income groups. So poorer people tended to have much smaller and more frequent top-ups, and wealthier people tend to have really large, less frequent top-ups. And then their mobility analysis could also tell you about kind of movement patterns and classify people maybe on economic strata or just kind of like the type of mobility that they have. So I'm just wondering if any of those kind of stratification concepts have come up in your work and what your thoughts are on that. Those questions were for Kasum or anyone else who might
Yeah.
have worked with mobile phone surveys.
Yeah. So Kasum, do you have any responses to some of those questions?
I do not have a response for her question, but we will investigate in this side to see what will be possible.
Okay, so I think we have a question from Ronto. Go ahead, please.
I have one question for Kasum and then I have a question for Dana. So for Kasum, you talked about the RDD and you also talked about like geographical representativeness. So I wanted to check what method did you use, to ensure that the RDD gives you good geographical representativeness in the exercise. And then for Dana, sometimes we have to remove some small population in the grid before selecting the sample in terms of efficiency, I assume. So in the manual, do we specify what is the recommend threshold, to say we're going to remove this very small grid in the sampling frame before sampling? Thanks. Over.
Okay. To ensure geographic representation, we use quota sampling. So we stratify our sample by urban and rural, and two main town in the country. And when and after that, we also use a post stratification weighting to ensure that we have a representative at the region level.
To answer the excellent question around excluding cells with very small population estimates, this was something that was more common before we had ways to group grid cells into sampling units, when we were stuck with using grid cells directly. And I know there's some teams that will exclude any cell with less than an estimate of 50 people, or with the old World Pop constrained data, they would have a fraction of a population allocated to very remote cells in forests and deserts and stuff. And so, less than one person would get automatically excluded. Most of the current data sets that are available for gridded population estimates do not have these fractions of people. They have whole counts of estimated people, and only in settled areas with either building footprints or some other kind of settlement information behind them. I would not recommend excluding anybody. I think that it's possible now with, the tools, however basic they are, there's a way to group everybody into a sampling unit. Some of those sampling units might be a little bit big, or they might, have a smaller population total, but I think there's a way to include everybody. So I think that's the advice in the manual, is to not exclude folks. I don't think that's best practice. But I do know it's commonly done for some of the random walk surveys that are done by opinion pollsters, where they have very limited budgets and timelines.
All right. Okay, we have a question from Boniface. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Mine is regarding the mobile phone data collection. I wanted to know whether there is a research base, like acceptable time range within which you're supposed to do your mobile phone interviews, because sometimes there's that caution, is like, don't make it too long. So how long is too long? And then for the data, for our program, we actually use participants, so it's easy because we already have a list. But I was wondering if we have the GPS where our participants come from, and then maybe we have collected data on their demographics. How could we use that for maybe visualizing the findings and Yeah, basically to make a decision-making process easier, if we are involving maybe the politicians to show that in this particular area we have a higher prevalence of a particular problem. Thank you. Maybe some technical guidance. Thanks.
Okay. For the duration, more than 15 minutes is not it's not good. The literature shows so that if you use a mobile phone survey, it's good to do not exceed 15 minutes in the questionnaire. For the location of the respondents, we just ask where this person live in the questionnaire. We ask the region, the town where he pick up the phone, and with this information we can show politicians where population are difficult to reach. And for our example, in the north of the Burkina Faso, it's difficult to reach people in this region because of insecurity, and some people also the terrorists destroy channel, the communication channel, and so on. Yes.
All right, thank you. So are there other questions? So a few people have asked in the chat. If you don't have access to the chat, please raise your hands and we can put you on screen. So I think there were a couple of comments from Brian in the chat. Brian, do you want to speak for the people who might not have been able to see the chat and share your comments?
Oh, have I been unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Sorry. Yeah, no, I just I posted a link to the Statistics Without Borders, who will provide statistical assistance. Specifically, we've been talking about sampling here. Will provide assistance to nonprofit organizations that need any help. I posted another comment about what I was working on recently in Afghanistan, which was a mobile phone survey. There's a company that did a lot of work in Afghanistan with mobile phones. And right now I'm blanking on their name, but they had certain information about the phone and where it was that we could use for geography. It was very broad, just the UN regions, which is like, I think 9 regions in Afghanistan they used. And we used the UN data to post stratify. It's very coarse. I really like, I doubt the SIM card issue was much of an issue there, but I could be wrong about that. Don't have information on that. But I really like that idea about, if you do have it, and linking it with income. That would certainly be nice.
All right, thank you. Do either of our speakers want to respond to that? To those comments? Are there any other questions for
Hi, Sarah.
any of our speakers?
Yeah, I have
Yes.
one question. You see, about 20 years back, when we were using landline for the RDD sample, so the simple, we used to get from the telephone exchange the area code and the other possible digits, and we were selecting the sample and then linking it to the block or the enumeration areas. But now with the mobile phones, people move from one, for example, in US, when they are in college or in school, they get their phone from the parents and they keep the same number, move to different states. So how do you link it to the area, to the state, or How do you solve that problem?
Okay, we did not collect information on the respondent movements, so it's difficult for us to respond to this question.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody for participating in this sessions, and especially the speakers for their fascinating presentations. So our time is up for this session. And just remind everybody, the second day of the meeting is tomorrow morning. It starts at 9 a.m. New York time. So Hao-Yi, did you want to have any closing messages here?
No, let's continue the discussion. And if you have any questions, also send us the questions.
Okay, we'll see everybody tomorrow. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.